Keanu Reeves stops for a homeless elderly woman, Margaret, and listens to her heartbreaking story of loss and survival. Moved by her pain, he offers her a safe place to stay, reminding her that she still matters. For the first time in years, Margaret feels seen, hopeful, and ready to start again. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories nobody expected at a Hollywood superstar driving alone at night, suddenly slamming his brakes in the middle of an empty Los Angeles street. But what happened next left the world speechless. Keanu Reeves, the man known for his kindness, did something so extraordinary that even those who witnessed it couldn't believe their eyes. It was a cold November night in the 2023, the kind where the wind bites through even the thickest coats. Keanu had just finished a quiet dinner in Beverly Hills and was heading home, lost in thought, when he noticed something on the sidewalk. A frail elderly woman hunched over, shivering under a tattered blanket. The sight made his heart clench. Most people would have driven past, barely noticing, but not Keanu. His foot hit the brake. Instinctively, his heart raced. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The street was empty. Without hesitation, he pulled over, stepping out into the chilly night. The woman's face was barely visible beneath layers of worn fabric. Her silver hair was tangled, her fingers trembling from the cold. She wasn't just homeless, she looked utterly lost, as if the world had forgotten her. Keanu knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "Ma'am, are you okay?" At first, she didn't respond. She only stared at him with tired, glassy eyes. But then, after a long silence, she whispered something so faint he almost missed it. "No one stops anymore." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Keanu swallowed the lump in his throat. How long had she been sitting here? How many people had walked past her without even glancing in her direction? He didn't know her story. Yet he didn't know how she had ended up here, alone, abandoned. But one thing was certain: he wasn't leaving her on the street. What Keanu did next, no one could have predicted. It wasn't just about giving her money or food. It was something far greater, something that would shake the world. When the truth came out, Keanu took off his coat without a second thought, draping it over her frail shoulders. The woman flinched at first, as if she wasn't used to kindness, then slowly pulled the fabric tighter around herself. "Leeton, get you somewhere warm," he said, softly, kneeling beside her. For a moment, she just stared at him, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Her eyes held a lifetime of pain, loss, loneliness, something unspoken, but heavy enough to make Keanu's chest tighten. He could tell she wasn't just cold, she was exhausted, both in body and in spirit. He extended his hand. "Please let me help." Her fingers hesitated before slipping into his. They were ice-cold, delicate, trembling. When he gently helped her to her feet, she swayed slightly, as if the world around her had lost its balance. "Do you have a name?" Keanu asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She lowered her gaze. "Margaret," she murmured. Margaret, a name that had probably been forgotten by the world long ago. Keanu felt an ache in his chest. He guided her carefully to his car, opening the passenger door. As if she were royalty, she hesitated before lowering herself into the seat, her fingers gripping the edges as though afraid the moment wasn't real. The streets were quiet as he drove. Margaret sat in silence and staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Couldn't press her to speak. He could feel it. This woman had a story, a past, a life that had somehow unraveled until she ended up on that cold sidewalk, invisible to the world. When they pulled up to a small 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city, Keanu parked and turned to her. "You hungry?" She nodded slowly, her lips quivering, but still she said nothing. Inside, the warm glow of the diner's lights cast a soft golden hue over the checkered floors. A waitress glanced up, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized Keanu, but he gave her a small shake of his head. This wasn't about him. They sat in a quiet booth near the window. Keanu ordered for both of them a simple meal: soup, warm bread, coffee. When the food arrived, Margaret stared at the steaming bowl for a long moment before picking up the spoon. The first sip seemed to melt something inside her. Her shoulders relaxed, her breath deepened, as though she was tasting warmth for the first time in years. Keanu watched her, waiting. Not rushing, just waiting. Then her voice barely above a whisper: "I had a son once." Keanu's heart stopped. She set the spoon down, her fingers curling around the edge of the table, as if steadying herself. "He was about your age, now kind, gentle. He had your eyes." A sad smile ghosted her lips. "In your voice." Keanu's throat tightened. "What happened to him?" he asked softly. Margaret exhaled, the weight of her memories pressing down on her. "He was in the army, sent overseas. He never came back." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Keanu reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt like the most important thing in the world. "You're not alone, Margaret," he said firmly, her eyes filled with tears. And for the first time that night, She let them fall. Keanu had no idea. Then that this moment, this chance encounter, was only the beginning. What happened next would change both of their lives forever in ways neither of them could have imagined. Keanu swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had never met this woman before tonight. Yet something about her felt strangely familiar, as if their paths were always meant to cross. The light turned green, and the car moved forward. But for Keanu, for Margaret, something had already shifted. The SUV moved steadily through the dimly lit streets, but inside time felt suspended. Keanu couldn't shake the weight of Margaret's words. "You remind me of him." It wasn't just the name Michael, it was something deeper, something unspoken, yet undeniable. Margaret sat still, gazing out the window, lost in memory. She had long buried. Keanu watched her, sensing the pain behind her silence. He knew that kind of grief, the kind that never really fades, just lingers beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. "You said you lost him," Keanu finally spoke, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "What happened to Michael?" Margaret's fingers twitched slightly, gripping the jacket around her. She inhaled sharply, as if pulling courage from the air. "It was years ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was just a boy full of dreams." Her lips trembled. "He wanted to be an actor. He used to watch old movies with me, memorize every line, every expression. He said one day he'd make me proud." Keanu's chest tightened. He could almost see it, the young boy eyes bright with ambition, reciting scenes to his mother, hoping to make her smile. Margaret swallowed hard, her next words coming out strained. "He never got the chance." A heavy silence followed. Keanu didn't press her, but she could feel his presence, his patience. She finally continued, her voice fragile. "He was 17 when he was diagnosed leukemia." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more, but no words came, only pain, only loss. "I tried everything, every treatment, every prayer," but her voice cracked and she turned away, blinking furiously. He was gone before his dreams could even begin. Keanu's heart ached. He reached out slowly, hesitating for a brief second before resting his hand gently over hers. Margaret, tense, but didn't pull away. Her fingers, cold and frail, twitched beneath his warmth. It had been so long since someone had held her hand, not out of pity, but out of understanding. "My sister had leukemia," Keanu finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I know that pain. I know what it's like to watch someone you love fade away, and you're helpless to stop it." Margaret turned, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. "You do?" He nodded, his gaze steady, filled with the kind of sorrow that only someone who had truly suffered could understand. A small, broken smile appeared on her lips, as if for the first time in years she didn't feel alone in her grief. The car pulled into a quiet street, the soft glow of a small cafe illuminating the sidewalk. Keanu turned to her. "Are you hungry?" Margaret blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him. And for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. "Hope." Margaret hesitated, aided the thought of sitting in a warm cafe, sharing a meal with someone who truly saw her, felt foreign, almost like a memory from another lifetime. For years, she had been invisible, just another forgotten soul on the streets, blending into the city's shadows. But now, under the soft glow of the street lights, Keanu was looking at her, as if she mattered. He pushed open the car door and stepped out, turning back to her with a gentle nod. "Come on," he said softly, offering his hand. Margaret stared at it, the last time someone had reached for her like that. It had been Michael, her son, a lifetime ago. Her lips parted slightly, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She had spent so long shrinking away from kindness, from trust. But something about Keanu, about the way he waited, patient and unhurried, made her heart take in a way she hadn't felt in years. With a shaky breath, she reached out, her frail fingers sliding into his grip was warm, steady, real. And in that moment, something inside her cracked open. Keanu led her toward the cafe, the bell above the door chiming softly as they stepped inside. The scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air, wrapping around her like a forgotten embrace. A few customers glanced up, some recognizing Keanu instantly, but their curiosity faded when they saw the quiet protectiveness in his posture. This wasn't a celebrity moment. This was something personal. A waitress, a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes, approached with a warm smile. "Welcome," and she said, "Table for two." Keanu nodded. "Someplace quiet if you have it." She led them to a small booth by the window, and Margaret hesitated again before slowly lowering herself onto the cushion seat. The warmth from the cafe seemed to settle in her bones, chasing away the cold that had been her constant companion for years. Keanu sat across from her, studying the menu for a moment before sliding it toward her. "Order whatever you want," he said gently. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she traced the laminated pages. It had been so long since she had chosen a meal, since she had been given a choice at all. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Just coffee would be nice. Keanu's brow furrowed. But he didn't push. Instead, he smiled coffee as he turned to the waitress. And a slice of whatever pie you recommend. Margaret's gaze snapped up. "Oh, don't trust me," Keanu interrupted softly. "You deserve something sweet." She swallowed hard emotion, tightening her throat. The waitress returned a few moments later, setting down a steaming cup of coffee in front of Margaret, and a thick slice of warm apple pie. The scent of cinnamon and sugar filling the air. Margaret stared at it, her hands resting on either side of the plate, as if afraid it might disappear. Keanu watched her closely. "When was the last time you had pie?" Margaret's lips parted, but no answer came. She didn't know. Slowly, she picked up the fork, cutting a small piece, and bringing it to her lips. The moment the sweetness touched her tongue, her eyes fluttered shut. A memory rushed in. Michael's birthday. She had baked him an apple pie from scratch. Laughing as he insisted on eating it straight from the dish, he had called it the best thing in the world. A tear slipped down her cheek. Keanu said nothing. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, giving her the space to feel, to remember, to grieve. Finally, she set the fork down, exhaling shakily. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu's gaze was steady. "For what?" Margaret met his eyes. "For reminding me that I'm still human." The words hit him harder than he expected. His throat tightened, because he understood the world had forgotten her. But tonight, she was seeing the cafe hummed with quiet conversations, the clinking of cups, and the occasional laughter from a distant table. But for Margaret, the world had narrowed to this small booth, to the warmth of the coffee between her hands, to the man sitting across from her, someone she never expected to meet, let alone share a meal with. Keanu leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. He could see the weight of years pressing down on her, the way she hesitated before every movement, as if life had trained her to expect disappointment. "Tell me about him," Kay said softly, breaking the silence. Margaret blinked, startled. "Who?" Michael, her breath caught in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had asked, so long since she had allowed herself to say his name out loud, to bring him back from the quiet corners of her memory, where she had tucked him away, safe from the world that had forgotten him. She placed her coffee down carefully, her hands folding together, as if bracing herself. He was everything. Her voice wavered, but didn't break. "He had this way of making people laugh. Even when things were hard, he used to tell me, Mom, one day I'm going to buy you the biggest house in the world, and you'll never have to worry again." A faint, wistful smile crossed her lips. "I'd always tell him, I don't need a big house, sweetheart. Just you." Keanu nodded, listening intently. "He works so hard." She continued, her eyes distant, lost in the past. "After his father left, it was just the two of us. He got a part-time job at a diner after school, always bringing home leftovers for me. Even though I knew he was hungrier than I was, he'd stay up late practicing monologues, watching old films, dreaming about the day he'd get his big break." Her voice grew softer, but life had other plans. Keanu remained silent, letting her set the pace. Margaret swallowed hard. "The doctor said it was aggressive, that we didn't have much time." She exhaled shakily. He never stopped smiling, though, even when the pain was unbearable, even when the treatments drained the light from his eyes. "He never let me see his fear." Her voice broke. Then, just for a second, he was more worried about me than himself. Keanu's throat tightened. He knew that kind of love, the selfless kind, the kind that never fades. Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached for the coffee, seeking warmth, grounding. "I sat by his bed every night, holding his hand, reading to him old scripts, movie scenes, anything he loved. And then one night, she didn't finish. She didn't have to." The silence between them was thick with grief, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. Keanu reached across the table, resting his hand gently over hers. She flinched at first, unaccustomed to kindness, but then she let it stay. A deep breath shuddered through her. "After he was gone, I couldn't keep up with the bills, lost the apartment, lost everything." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I stopped matching." Keanu's grip on her hand tightened, just slightly grounding her. "That's not true," he said firmly. Margaret let out a small broken laugh. "Tell that to the world." Keanu exhaled slowly. He had spent years watching how fame could make people feel seen, but he had also learned how easy it was to disappear, to slip through the cracks when the world decided you weren't worth looking at anymore. But Margaret was worth looking at, worth remembering. A thought formed in his mind, an idea that felt so clear, so right. He didn't even hesitate before saying it. "Come with me," he said suddenly. Margaret's brows furrowed. "What?" Keanu leaned forward. "I have a guest house. It's quiet, safe. You don't have to stay on the streets anymore." Margaret stiffened, shaking her head. "Kay, I can't. I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," he said gently. "This is one human helping another." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why She whispered. Keanu held her gaze. Because Michael would have wanted someone to do this for you. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, a sob escaping. Before she could stop it, she had spent years feeling invisible, discarded, and now for the first time in a long time she felt seen. But could she accept it? Could she believe in kindness again? Keanu waited. He would wait as long as it took, and in that quiet little cafe a decision was being made, one that would change both their lives forever. Margaret sat, frozen, her heart pounding beneath layers of grief and disbelief. Keanu's words echoed in her mind. Michael would have wanted someone to do this for you. The weight of them cracked something deep inside her, something she had buried for years. Could she trust this? Could she trust him? Her entire life had been a series of losses, each one stripping her of hope, of dignity, of the belief that kindness could exist without conditions. And yet here he was, a man who had everything, offering something no one had given her in years, a second chance. Tears slid down her wrinkled cheeks. I don't know how to start over, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Keanu's expression softened. You don't have to do it alone. A quiet sob escaped her lips, and before she could stop herself, she reached for his hand, gripping it like a lifeline. She had been drowning for so long, and now, for the first time in years, someone was pulling her back to shore. Keanu gave her a reassuring squeeze before slipping a few bills onto the table. Then, with careful patience, he helped her to her feet. She wavered slightly, as if uncertain whether she was truly awake or trapped in some fragile dream that might shatter at any moment. The night air was cool as they stepped outside, but for the first time the cold didn't feel so unbearable. Ken led her back to the SUV, and she hesitated just before stepping in. This feels unreal, she admitted. Keanu smiled, then lead and make it real. The car ride was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the city moving around them. Margaret clutched Keanu's jacket tightly around her shoulders, feeling the lingering warmth of him. She had spent so long fading into the background of the world that she had forgotten what it felt like to exist in someone's story, not as a passerby, but as someone who mattered. When the SUV finally pulled up to a secluded ivy-covered home, Margaret's breath caught. The house was warm, inviting, not a mansion, not some sterile, oversized space, but a home. Keanu stepped out and opened the door for her. Come on, he said gently. Margaret took a shaky step forward, her eyes darting around, as if expecting the moment to dissolve into a cruel trick, but nothing disappeared. The porch light was on, the air smelled like fresh rain. The world was still here, waiting for her. Guided her to a small guest house tucked beneath towering oak trees. He pushed open the door, revealing a cozy living space, soft lighting, a plush armchair by the window, a fur place flickering gently. A place meant to be lived in. Margaret stepped inside, slowly running her fingers over the edge of a wooden table, the back of the chair, the folds of a soft blanket draped over the couch. It had been years since she had touched something that felt like home. She turned back to Keanu, her voice trembling. I don't deserve this. He shook his head. Everyone deserves kindness. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't just from sadness, they were from something deeper, something unfamiliar. Hope. Margaret had spent so many years believing she was forgotten, that the world had moved on without her. But tonight, in the warmth of this unexpected kindness, she realized something. She had been lost for a long time, but she wasn't lost anymore, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet.